So the vast majority of the 9th edition rules are out now. Pretty huge and in-depth codexes, perhaps more so than ever before in 40k. Still though, there's a bunch of armies and sub-factions that I feel are just a little bit unexplored, so let's talk about the Games Workshop's armies that slipped through the cracks. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's armies that they should support better, mainly focusing on just a few sub-factions and formations that I think the Games Workshop could really easily make some simple rules for, and maybe make a bunch of people happy. Obviously, just about every army would ideally want a bunch of new models and support, but today I thought I'd mainly want to focus on the 9th edition rules, and perhaps just a few easy army types and sub-factions that they could easily flesh out a bit with just a little bit more rule support. So as 9th edition has unfolded, Games Workshop has come out with quite a bit of supplemental rules for the various different factions. Some of it I think has been decent, though some of it may be a little bit pointless or a bit overpowered in cases. Like codexes, sometimes they get it right, sometimes they really don't. I feel like it has been pretty interesting though to see them really expand and flesh out on some small sub-factions in the lore, perhaps more than they've ever have been before. I did think it was quite cool when, say for example, Blood Axe Orcs got their supplement with sniper weapons and surprising commandos, or even minor orders of the Adeptus Sororitas were being supported with a bunch of in-depth rules, things like the Bloody Rose. The way they've generally done this is with two different mechanisms, either Armies of Renown, where the basic idea is that you trade off a limited roster for better rule support. Normally you can only take a section of your codex, but that section gets extra good and has better stratagems. I personally really quite like the Armies of Renown when they're done well. The idea would be that they make a different way to play a codex that forces you in a very different direction to the normal book, but at the same time isn't either vastly under or overpowered, and it's just a viable alternative. I feel like the Ork Speed War is a good example of that. If you want to make a Mad Max list built around buggies and bikes, then it'll allow you to do so with some nice boosts. Or say for example the Imperial Knight Freeblade Lance, giving you some fun rules for an eclectic court of different nobles. The other option that they go down are the sub-faction supplements, more options like stratagems, warlord traits and relics and things for certain sub-factions like say the Metallica Forge World for Abmech or Blood Axes for Orcs. I'd say I'm a little bit less enthused by those, as they maybe feel just a bit more like rules bloat and making those sub-factions a lot more supported than other ones. Perhaps a little bit less interesting than Armies of Renown on the whole, but still can be a good way to add a lot of fun flavour. In general, I'd say that their Codex plus supplement system is one that's got some positives and negatives. People do tend to talk about the negatives a lot, say things like needing more rules that are in just the Codex, and adding a bunch more niche rules to the 40k rule system that's already a little bit on the bloated side. I feel like they're probably at their worst when they're trying to sell you them for £30 for basically just a page or two's content within a book. I do much prefer it when they either decide to make extra content as downloadable things that you can just print off if you want, or at least have them available in a White Dwarf publication, which costs a whole load less than a massive book. As mentioned though, I do think that they really have their positives, digging into obscure sections of the 40k lore and making it happen on the table. And Armies of Renown are a pretty interesting side grade idea. You give up a bunch of stuff, but it makes one army archetype a lot more playable, say like the bikes and buggies of Speed War, or a zombie-themed Death Guard army in the Terminus Est Strike Force. I think they've made a fair amount of good content for these, but I would say that there's maybe a few obvious picks that they've left on the table, major sub-factions that haven't seen too much support, and a couple of things that could make some really easy Armies of Renown, and hopefully make a fluffy build viable again. So first up for an army that I think could do with a little bit more depth and flavour will be the Farsight Enclaves, the rebellious Tau that broke away from the Ethereals and now do things their own way, free from their guidance and strict oversight. I'd say that broadly speaking, from the 8th edition to the 9th edition codexes, in general most of the rule systems were normally translated over, but the Tau Codex didn't have that much support for the Enclaves at all. They don't really function much different to a standard Sept, except that you can't take Ethereals and you can take a few commanders. I would argue that the army in general doesn't really need a power boost, more just a few different options for flavour type purposes. The Farsight Enclaves is a pretty strong choice for playing Tau competitively at the moment, alongside the regular Tau Sept. Having more than one commander per detachment is particularly strong. I feel like Tau players would really quite like a datasheet for the 8, even if it's maybe a more of a fun and fluffy one, rather than anything particularly competitive or honed. The idea behind that being 8 different crisis commanders all working together, and basically being the ultimate battlesuit bomb, soaring through a war zone and obliterating the foes with some high power weapons. Otherwise, in previous expansions that they had in older 40k, they had some relics called the Fusion Blades, some fun anti-tank sort of combat weapons for a battlesuit, a mirror codex that can basically counter the Adeptus Astartes, and something called a seismic fibrillator node that would turn the nearby terrain into dangerous terrain for the enemy. I guess with the Tau Codex only having come out at the start of this year, I feel like it's perhaps more possible than most that they might release a Farsight Enclaves supplement before the end of 9th edition. Farsight has previously been rumoured to be getting a new model at some stage, and I guess if he did, then that would be the ultimate excuse to give them a rules makeover, potentially with a new datasheet for the commander himself in with them. Moving on, and one in particular from the new Guard Codex that stands out would be something like a Tempestus Scion Air Cavalry Army of Renown. Perhaps an army that just needs a little bit of special treatment from the game of 40k at the moment, as it's really left them high and dry. Since the Valkyrie model came out, it's been at least a small popular build to basically have stormtroopers jumping out of Valkyries and hitting the enemy with special weapons, maybe throwing demo charges around. A build that's maybe had its moments, but certainly in recent years hasn't been very competitive at all throughout 8th edition. In terms of armies that are supposed to bring a lot of flyers, it's perhaps one of the most fluffy out there, and I feel like it's maybe caught some unfortunate flack from the 9th edition rules. Currently in match play at least, Games Workshop introduced a hard cap on flyers. You can't take any more than 2 per standard game of 40k. I think for a lot of factions this perhaps makes sense, and makes sure that the focus is on the ground troops, with the flyers being a supporting element rather than the mainstay of the list, like the nightmarish Eldar flyer lists of 8th edition, or the fairly ridiculous things that Orks or Admech could do in 9th, with a whole bunch of freebooters planes flying over and obliterating the enemy, or kind of the same for the Admech with Stratoraptors and the bombers. I kind of feel like for Militarum Tempestus, though, the flyer nerfs just aren't really that needed maybe. Valkyries are very usable transports, but I feel like their damage just probably isn't quite strong enough to be of an enormous threat to the entire enemy army. They're largely going to be blazing away with some heavy bolters and some anti-light infantry shots, perhaps not going to be shooting to the extent where you're going to be worried that you're going to be tabling an army turn 1. I feel like for this one at least, there really is scope for making an interesting and tailored Army of Renown to try and make air cavalry a thing once more. Have the basic rule for the Army of Renown be that you get to ignore the flyer cap even in match play games, and then maybe limit the force to just taking Militarum Tempestus units, plus perhaps Valkyries, Commissars, and maybe Militarum Auxilia perhaps. I guess it'd be the sort of thing that would need a bit of playtesting to make sure that it can't do too powerful alpha strikes. Maybe they could even have some special rule in the detachment saying that you need to take half of your Valkyries and put them in reserve or something, if they were worried about an alpha strike potential being too high with Scions getting out and firing special weapons off. I feel like you could make some pretty interesting stratagems as well for Scions jumping in and out of planes all game long. Maybe bring back a few of the ones that they had from their Militarum Tempestus supplement in the Greater Good book. It just seems a bit weird at the moment for a formation that they actually had specific formation type rules for in 8th edition to have absolutely no way to play it in 9th, just because some flyers from other factions were causing issues. Next up are another set of rules that I think again could be really quite a popular targeted supplement if Games Workshop did want to release them, and that would be some better rule support for the various flavour of Renegade Chaos. Again, a rule section that was cut from the 9th edition codex, perhaps surprisingly so, when they probably could have got away with just a literal extra page worth of rules content. Throughout 8th edition and early 9th, the Chaos Space Marines had rules for a bunch of their different Renegade Warbands, the Red Corsairs, which did receive some much more extensive support in the Chaos Space Marine Codex, but also a bunch of other flavours of Renegades, the Crimson Slaughter, the Dark Vengeance antagonists, the Purge who believe all life is worthless and worship Nurgle that way, the Brazen Beasts with their Cornate Demon engines, the Scourge and the Flawless Host, 4 Renegades for Tzeentch and Slaanesh respectively, and of course the Fallen, the Bad Dark Angels from the Heresy. I kind of feel that this rules content might be the bit that they chose to trim just because they gave the legions quite so many in-depth rules in the actual book. The Chaos Space Marine Codex is a particularly rules-dense one, essentially containing 8 different mini-supplements for the legions and creations of Bile and Red Corsairs. It still did feel a bit odd though that given that they put so much effort into realising the rules for all of those, that they didn't just tack on a little section for custom warbands or something like that, even if the rules were kind of underwhelming by any stretch of the imagination. Again, maybe similar to the Farsight Enclaves, I do kind of wonder whether Games Workshop is saving it as content to release later in the edition. Not that it sounds like there's a lot of that left by all accounts. Again, kind of compared with just individual obscure Space Marine chapters from the lore, or giving us further content for fairly niche sub-factions than the lore like the Metallica Forge world or the Cult of Strife, I feel like this one might feel like a bit more of a necessary supplement if they still want to do them. Could be a reasonable one to have as a download or in a White Dwarf, I guess. A few of these armies really were quite interesting for playing on the tabletop as well. The Flawless Host could make some interesting combos with Lord Discordance, and the Purge were a pretty effective one for shooty Chaos Space Marines, getting you +1s to hit if you actually cause some casualties. Next up, I feel like the Orcs, while they did get some good support with that speed war, if you want to make a Mad Max buggy themed army, I feel like they could make an Ork Dread Mob with a very similar kind of feel. And I feel like as a unit class within the codex, they are maybe one of the single best areas that you could target, and it be an objective buff and a good one. Orcs are perhaps an army that do have really quite a lot of themes that you can go down. They do like to obsess over certain ways of making war. I feel like you could credibly make a formation that rewards something like Blitz Brigade, maybe Beast Snaggers as an army in their own right, or Green Tide. Reward knobs in battle wagons, Games Workshop's new Savage Orcs with a squig aesthetic, or have a bit more support to make hordes of boys work. Currently, I do think that speed mob does its job very decently. It gives you a bit more incentive to put things like Deathcopters and lots of different buggies on the table, gives them powerful buffs, but certainly balanced out by having very limited access to the vast majority of units in the book. Dread Mob just seems like a particularly easy one that they could realise like this though, as the Orc Walkers in general have a fair few models. You've got Killercans, Death Dreads, Morkanauts and Gorkanauts plus Stompers, and even the very best of them are kind of merely okay at the moment. The bigger ones are in particular very weak for the points. I guess if you made an army of renown centered around them, you'd probably restrict it to Orky Walkers plus mechs to make them better. Maybe you could add in some basic boys as well in small numbers, perhaps similar to the way that the Necron Cryptek formation recently did allow you to get some warriors, but didn't really have them as the focus. Then similar to the Speed Mob, you could give them a spearhead formation that responds some CP, and give the walkers some meaningful damage and defense boost as a reward instead of the main clan traits. It's every mech's dream to make an entire tide of walkers so powerful that it can be a war in its own right. Quite a few people have got some themed armies that they can put on the tabletop in a similar sort of fashion, and I think that it would be pretty good fun to give them some flavourful rules to run an army like that. So I'd say that those ones might be some of my first choices for different things that you could explore in 40k. But beyond them, there seem like there are quite a lot of other obvious picks as well that they could do rules for. Maybe some of these look again quite obvious. They could do a Chaos Knight Dreadblade Lance to mirror the Freeblade one for the Imperials. The Freeblade one is quite nice for making the Freeblade mechanic work in a big way, so this could be the same for the Chaos. They made a Space Marine Phobos Army of Renown that was kind of bad, but interesting enough if you did want to go down that route. I feel like they could easily do one for Gravis armor. You've got Gravis slots in all of the major force organization choices now. You might just have to be a little bit more lenient on the HQs. Otherwise, you've got Aggrettors, Heavy Intercessors, Inceptors, and Eradicators. Potentially an entire force of chunky boys, maybe with some repulsors as transports perhaps. Feels like that could be a good force, and you could probably afford to give them some pretty serious buffs at the moment. Space Marines currently having the power problems that they do. Another one that's maybe a bit of a halfway house as a faction might be the Inari, who again kind of went from being a mini faction in their own right to more representing a craft world that can get some more units in it. I guess they do have their unique characters plus their own psychic discipline, but they did lose a bunch of interesting stuff from Strength from Death and some stratagems and things. I feel like they could warrant a bit of extra support if Games Workshop wanted them to. Admittedly, Inari certainly don't need a power boost, so you'd have to be careful to avoid that. They seem to be doing absolutely fine competitively at the moment. Let me know your thoughts though. I'm sure there's some other really good choices that you're missing. If you had to make an army of renown for your own faction to focus on one area of the list, what might it be? So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a few musings as to some areas of 40k I feel that Games Workshop could go into a little bit more. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments as always. It's always good to have a read. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, so feel free to subscribe or check back later for more. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you're interested in supporting. The channel's Patreon is the thing that allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next to the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.